We're going to continue the series from Eden. We're talking about sin. You guys told me how much you love it when I preach on sin, so I'm trying to do that more. And that was a joke also. It is a different take, though, right? Well, when we're talking about sin, we're talking about it from a healthier perspective. This isn't a toxic guilt trip. This isn't a pretense saying, well, we're all sinners. Who cares? It's no big deal. We're not going to take either extreme position. We're not going to say sin doesn't matter because everybody's a sinner. But we're also not going to say sin means you're all a bunch of horrible people from birth and there's no hope. Both of those positions are unhealthy and unhelpful. So instead, we're looking at a biblical perspective on sin. And this week, we get to talk about one of those fun sin topics, sex. And as I know from being a student in Bible college 10 years ago, talking about sex in the Bible can make people uncomfortable. I would use the word cringy. But Ian, who led worship up here this morning, Ian told me as a Gen Z guy that cringy with a Y is cringe, that I shouldn't say it like that. I should say cringe, drop the Y. So apparently being cringy is cringe. Being cringy is cringe, right? And all of this is cringe. So I'm going to drop it. Some of you have no idea what I'm talking about because you're boomers and you can't hear me. That was a joke. From childhood, have I broken the ice to talk about sex? Okay. From childhood, I think we are all at least a little nervous or confused or even guilt-ridden to talk about sex, almost more than anything else topically. It's what Carl Jung would call a complex that many of us suffer from. Various thoughts or images that hold all kinds of strong unconscious energy flowing out in irrational directions. Our reactions are always strange and confused when we're in the grip of a complex, whether it's overly positive or overly negative. What I want to point out today is, as we look at a couple of stories in the Bible, sex isn't sinful. We know that, right? Sex is how we create life. It's the origin of birth. We know it's a good thing. It's not inherently sinful, but it is in some ways a litmus test or a testing apparatus for love. And I hope to make that clear this morning, that sex is a testing apparatus for love as opposed to an alternative which might be lust for power or pleasure or whatever else. In short, humans have a hard time distinguishing between love and lust. For most men in particular, and women are also guilty, but especially men, it takes much of our lives to finally know the difference if we ever figure it out. And we have just such men illustrated today in the Old and New Testaments of the Bible, and two women who are the worse for it. So I want to look at the first story. This is going to take a while, so I want to get right into it. Genesis 38. And as we open to Genesis 38, you'll notice we're quite a few chapters ahead of where we stopped last week and the week before. So we've worked our way further and further east from Eden, as Steinbeck would coin it. We've gone beyond the city of Nod, beyond the murder of a brother, beyond the hiding of Adam and Eve from God in the very beginning. Now we've gone into the further reaches of humanity. People are becoming more and more sick with sin. We've gone beyond the flood, the diluvian world. This is now the post-diluvian world. It's been flooded, it's been repopulated, and however you understand that story geographically, globally, really doesn't matter because the theological import is that people are broken. They're not working the way they're supposed to work. And we see evidence of that in today's story, Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38. These are the effects of sin as humanity has moved further from Eden. So Adam knew his wife, they had a baby, life comes into the world. Now, let's see how far the apple has fallen from the tree. That's another good joke for you. That was pun intended. Okay, let me look at what verses I want to read here. Let's start in verse 6. Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. So Judah, if you don't know who that is one of the tribal leaders of Israel. He's the son of Jacob, right? Or Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Judah is this great older brother in the family, great in the sense of being above the others, not great as in morally upright. We're going to find out he's got a lot of problems. Judah becomes a namesake for generations. People like Jude or Judas in the Bible, named after Judah. He's a complicated guy. He has a son named his firstborn, and he takes a wife for him named Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. It doesn't tell us how or why. It just says God put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, now that is the next brother, go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law for her and raise up offspring for your brother. So basically, she hasn't had any children. Now she's a widow, and as a childless widow, she's destitute without help. So the next oldest brother should go in and help get her pregnant, give her a child to carry on the family name and to work and provide and care for his mother. Okay? So this brother, Onan, is supposed to do that job. But Onan, verse 9, knew that the offspring wouldn't be his, so he's being selfish. And whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and God put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up. So now this is the third brother, the youngest, and he feared that he would die like his other brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. In the course of time, that's a sad phrase in the Bible. It usually means people didn't do what they said they were going to do. The wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died, and when Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah, to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hirah the Adullamite. And when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, that's a euphemism, by the way, to shear his sheep. We'll talk about that. She took off her widow's garments. Remember, she's had a husband and then a brother who wouldn't fulfill his duty, and both of them are now dead, and she should have been married to the third brother, or at least impregnated by the third brother to give her a child. And the father-in-law says no, he's not ready for that, and just holds back and doesn't fulfill his promise. So now she is widowed, childless, and feeling destitute after years have gone on. And so she comes up with her own plan. She's going to go seduce her father-in-law while he's away shearing his sheep. Now, he is literally going to have his sheep sheared, but it's a Hebrew euphemism because when you go to have your sheep sheared, you come into a financial windfall, and you're away from your family, your wife, or if you have a harem, the other women back home, and your sons and daughters, and anybody else who would care what you actually do. Now you're out here on your own with money in your pocket. You can imagine what kind of trouble people get into. So now Judah and his buddy have gone to shear their sheep, and they've got money in their pockets, and again, that sets the scene. And now we have Tamar deciding that she's going to take care of matters herself. So she took off her widow's garments and covered herself up with a veil, wrapping herself, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and yet she had not been given to him in marriage, meaning they lied to her. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, come, let me come in to you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, what will you give me that you may come in to me? He answered, I'll send you a young goat from the flock. Sounds about fair. She said, if you give me a pledge until you send it. So again, she's saying, you lied to me once. What's to say you're not going to lie to me again? Prove it. Give me some kind of pledge. He said, what pledge shall I give you? She replied, your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand. So he gave them to her, and he went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, where's the cult prostitute who was at Enaim at the roadside? And they said, no cult prostitute has been here. So he returned to Judah and said, I haven't found her. Also the men of the place said, there is no cult prostitute here. And Judah replied, let her keep the things as her own, unless we're laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you didn't find her. So now he's worried he's going to become a laughingstock. About 3 months later, which is enough time for a baby to begin to show in the womb, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she's pregnant by immorality. Judah said, let bygones be bygones. I've made mistakes. No, I'm sorry. Moreover, he said, bring her out and let her be burned. And as she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, by the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. Oh, savage. She said, please, is that cringy? Is that cringe to say savage? Please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. Then Judah identified them and said, she is more righteous than I. since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not know her again. This is a word from the Lord. Thanks be to God. It's a weird story. How many of you are familiar with that story? Anybody? Yeah, we all study that in kindergarten, kids' church. I really don't think I need to over-explain it. We read the story. I tried to explain it as we went. I want to get to another story that I think is just as important, maybe more so, in the New Testament. But I do want to say a couple of things. For Judah, when we look at a story like this, sex is a selfish ritual. It is a great testing apparatus for love because Judah is not using sex in a loving way. He's using it in a lustful way to get what he wants, in this case, pleasure. But even Tamar is using it as a tool against injustice. Hers is a little more righteous of a cause, but she's still using it not as an act of love, but almost a mixture of desperation and punishment for her father-in-law. She's using it as a tool against injustice. She's using it in a lust for power, to gain power over her circumstances that she has no grip on. Again, we can feel for her, but it doesn't make it right. What isn't happening in this story is love. That's for certain. The one thing that's lacking is love. Now, a woman's only chance out of this situation was probably to get pregnant. And we can at least try not to vilify Tamar too badly, knowing that her situation was desperate. But we can't say what she did was good. And so we're left in this sort of gray area where sex is a great test of what love doesn't look like for these two people. But it didn't have to be that way. This is a story of what is, but not what must be. There's a great portrait by Eric de Gelder, who's a student of Rembrandt, one of his very last pupils. This was painted in 1667, and that's Judah and Tamar, it's supposed to be. What I think is fascinating, well, first of all, the staff is supposed to be like a phallic shape, and so the insinuation is this is a lustful assault. And he's grabbing her around the neck. He's fueled by lust. We see Judah is the bad guy here. And yet Tamar, as she's being grabbed around the neck, is extending her hand for payment. She knows she needs to get something out of this arrangement. And so we see that this is a picture of what is about to be a sexual relationship, but both parties are fueled in unhealthy ways because neither of them love the other. They're both using the other for a different purpose. They're both using the other for a lust of either pleasure or power. This is why sex is a great test for love, because it reveals what's in our hearts. Judah later is going to be quick to punish his daughter-in-law for the very same sin in which he participated, which begs the question, why are people such hypocrites? But I guess I should know, and you probably know too, because it's very human of us to be hypocritical. Making accusations is easy. Telling people that they're wrong is almost pleasurable in itself. It's fun to be right, and it's entertaining to tell people how wrong they are. Repentance, much more difficult. Double standards are commonplace because we easily see sin in others that we ignore in ourselves. In fact, we often project the sin that's in us onto other people, and we put our guilt on those people so that we don't have to deal with the shame of it. How many of you would admit that you do that in your life? I didn't think you'd admit it, but you do it. You're guilty. I do it. We project our sin and our guilt onto those around us. It's easy to do. Contrary to the command of God, in this life, judgment seems to overpower mercy. And yet we love a story that reminds us in the end, as God promised, mercy will triumph over judgment. We love any good story like that. Judah and Tamar's story seems to have an element of that. It doesn't fully become resolved, and it's part of the muddy patriarchal history of Israel. Jesus will tell a story later that helps shed more light on it. But I want to talk about another story in between, and that is the greatest animated Disney film of all time, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Prove me wrong. This movie is a classic. Not only is it based on a phenomenal novel by Victor Hugo, the same guy who did Les Mis. Anybody know Les Mis? Anybody know The Hunchback of Notre Dame? So, it's been adapted on film and on stage for generations. But this version is the one many of us know because it's from the 90s and it's more recent. And it's fantastic. It's one of the best cartoons ever. Theological lessons, moral lessons, an incredible soundtrack, should have won awards, but Beauty and the Beast, I think, stole the awards that year. I don't remember. I'm just angry a little bit. My favorite scene in The Hunchback of Notre Dame is the juxtaposed songs Heaven's Light and Hellfire. And now even less of you are going to get that reference. So some of you at least recognize the movie. How many of you know the songs from the movie? Anybody? Okay, there are songs in the middle of the movie called Heaven's Light and Hellfire. Quasimodo sings Heaven's Light. Frollo sings Hellfire. And they sing them right back to back. And in the middle, the transition from one into the other is this really cool Latin chanting, Gregorian chanting. The monks in Notre Dame, in the church, they're chanting Domine et Patre, and anyway, they're praying. And then they start to sing Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison, Lord, have mercy, Lord, have mercy. It's just a really beautiful, beautiful piece. And in a cartoon from Disney, no less. But the juxtaposition is great. Quasimodo is singing about the same woman, Esmeralda, this gypsy that he has fallen in love with, and he thinks maybe she could care for him too. And it's all happening in this, softly lit scene. He lives in darkness. If you don't know the story, Quasimodo means half-formed, quasi, partial, and modo formed. So he's half-formed. He's got a hunchback. He's deformed. He's disabled. And so he works as a bell ringer in the church, tucked away in hiding. And the only one who's ever cared for him has done so out of selfish motives and for self-preservation. And that's Frollo, who in the story is the archdeacon of the church. In the Disney movie, I think they called him the judge or something. But in the story, he's an archdeacon. He's a church leader. And he's a corrupt one. And he's very self-righteous. Well, anyway, Quasimodo is a sweet guy, right? He lives here by himself. He's never really felt the touch of love. And now this woman seems to care for him. And the thought of someone caring for him, the idea of real love, inspires him to sing this beautiful little melodic song, Heaven's Light. It almost looks like Heaven's Light. And then all of a sudden it gets dark, and the monks come out chanting with their hoods on. And then you see Frollo in the fiery, dark room. There's a literal fireplace next to him, fueled with flame, and he's singing about his lust for Esmeralda. And he's asking the beloved Mother Mary why she would let him endure this kind of temptation, to want to be with this gypsy woman who is a heathen, a wretch, even though he is this pious, wonderful man of God. He's overcome with lust, and he's blinded by it. It's really, again, you should just YouTube it later. It's really good. Love and lust, they're not just the themes in a good story or a good movie. They are the themes of Scripture. They're the themes of faith. Do we really love God, or do we just want to feel good and have more power? That's at the root of all sin. And that's why sex is such a great test, because it exposes that division. It makes plain what we want to pretend isn't real, that we are often led by lust instead of love. And so the humble and self-aware Quasimodo grows capable of love, and of course at the end of the story he offers himself in love to save Esmeralda and some others from a fire, and it's a great story. But the proud and vile Frollo, he is despondent, he's angry, and his lust, his craving of pleasure and power leads him to self-destruction. And it's a classic story of unrepentant sin and a story of love that conquers evil. That's why it's such a good story. The bookends to this film are Clopin, who's like the narration voice. He's apparently another gypsy guy in the movie. But he opens by saying, who is the monster and who is the man? And at the end of the story, he says, so who is the monster and who is the man? Which is really a way of asking, who is capable of love? Because in the beginning, you see a hunchback living in the shadows of a cathedral, and you think he's a monster. But by the end of the story, he's the hero, and the man who's this great, pious leader of the church is actually the monster. We love that story because we know it's our story. We love the story because it exposes us. Who is capable of true love? Who is the monster? And who is the human? Jesus begs the same question in the Gospel of John, chapter 8. And this is a story I'm most excited to talk about. Many of you will be familiar with this one. We call it the woman taken in adultery. John chapter 8, beginning in verse 1, reading through verse 11. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives early in the morning. He came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law of Moses, it is commanded for us to stone such women. What do you say?" They said this to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. But Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." Once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, until Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. When you read that story, how many of you have heard that one before? Anybody? Okay, when you read that story, you wonder, where's the man? It's a good question to ask. He's probably a plant, and so he's not going to be tried in the same way. If he wasn't a plant, he's still a man, so he's not going to be treated the same way as a woman. But we don't have time to get into that for this sermon. Instead, I want to ask the question, who is the woman? It's as if the story of Judah and Tamar has been brought into fresh perspective, and we don't need to know who Judah is or who Tamar is or what their situation was or why they're in the predicament that they're in. As if Jesus wants us to understand the things that mark the story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis are not who they are in their current situation, but at the root, what it means to love or to lust, what it means to overcome sin, what it means to be forgiven, what it means to be honest about ourselves. We find instead a woman who's nameless and no man to be found. Bowed down and broken in utter humiliation, her shriek for mercy must have been heard across the temple courtyards. Few could have stood up to this sort of public verbal flogging. She was probably half naked or completely naked in front of all these witnesses. And with frenzied fervor, the self-righteous accusers fueled the crowd with anger and wrath. All the proud hearts piled on. Like a lonely, scared dog surrounded by a pack of wolves, this outmanned woman stood paralyzed with fear. No doubt jealous of Jesus, the scholars, the religious leaders, the scribes and Pharisees, they interrupt the rabbi's teaching. They lay a trap to catch him within the law of Moses. Yet with a stroke of humble genius, instead of falling into their snare, Jesus turns the trap around on them. Jesus answers with a question related to their sinfulness. He says, "Are you perfect? How about those of you who are perfect? You can be the ones to cast the stone. Go ahead, kill her. But if not, extend to this fellow human the same mercy and grace that you yourself need." Jesus elevates compassion over condemnation to illustrate his radical love. That's what makes this story so great. Again, the story isn't even really about sex. Sex is the beginning. It's the test to describe, love and lust and why we do the things we do. It's a test of the heart. But the story was never really about sex at all. Neither was Judah and Tamar. These stories aren't about what we want them to be about. They're about us. We want it to just be, you shouldn't smoke, drink, or chew, or run with girls who do. We want that to be sin. But Jesus says it is a heart problem. It's much deeper than that. It's not what you do or don't do. It's who you are. Are you sick or are you well? Do you love? Do you lust? This woman is in an impossible situation. We don't need to know how she got there. We just need to know that she's desperate. Rembrandt paints this beautifully, and I think that the Hunchback of Notre Dame borrowed elements from this portrait. It's a little harder to see than the last one. Rembrandt, of course, was the teacher of the last man that we saw. And this portrait is the woman taken in adultery. But as you can see, she is the only one in the presence of Jesus there. She's the only one sitting inside of heaven's light. The one who's the monster about to be stoned, bowing before Jesus in heavenly light. And then who's in the darkness but all the religious leaders, cowering in their own fear, projecting their own guilt onto this woman? Who is the monster in such a portrait? What is more powerful to transform lives, heaven's light or hellfire? I wonder if you who are without sin should cast the first stone might be the most consoling words ever spoken on the planet in the presence of a shamed person. What do those words mean for you? Christ's compassion, so evident with those of us who are caught in crises caused by sin. When we remember our own flaws and we're able to withhold the casting of stones at other people. We're willing to have a dignified dialogue with those who differ from us. Humility, self-awareness that breeds mercy. This is why Jesus demands confession and repentance, not to feel guilty, but to stay humble, to develop mercy. Lust for pleasure and power can indeed lead us back to love. That's the good news. Judah and Tamar's story is never righted, not really. But this story has resolve. Jesus takes the unnamed and he says to her, you are a child of God. Let the lust and brokenness and sin that led you to this place bring you back into the heart of God's love. Go and sin no more. There's resolution if we humble ourselves, if true repentance is present. Personally, I wonder what Jesus might have written. It's the only time in the Gospels Jesus ever writes anything, and people speculate he wrote the sins of the people around him in the crowd, and they'd see their sins written in the dust, and then they'd feel guilty, and they'd walk away. Could be. I wonder if he was just distracting himself, just scribbling nothingness in the sand, because he didn't want to look at these men and give them the same condemnation that they were giving to this woman. What if Jesus was showing them mercy? I sometimes wonder that. If he just wanted them to take responsibility for their own lives. His love was so gracious, so universal, that he wanted even to save these accusers from themselves. So that when he says, neither do I condemn you, he says it not only to her, but to all the men who have, in humility, walked away. Neither do I condemn you. Zechariah 7, verse 9. One of the most powerful prophetic verses in the Bible. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another. If your friend or your loved one has been caught in sin, avoid the temptation to pile on with all the other self-righteous souls. Instead, ask the Lord how he's loved you, even when you have sinned against yourself and others. Like Jesus, lift up the fallen one. Help him or her to find a better way. If foolishness has influenced you, find real friends that will lift you up and walk with you in the way of the Lord. Compassion looks to catch someone doing good rather than to condemn. It helps her grow into the best version of herself. Mercy offers hope, and it's my hope that you feel supported this morning. As we think about sin, and we think about the way it pulls us from God and destroys our relationships with one another, it's easy to feel isolated. It's easy to feel alone. But you are most assuredly not alone in your despair, in your struggles, in your darkness, or even in your light. You are not alone. To believe that we are utterly alone is perhaps the enemy's most subtle form of attack. To isolate you, as the woman was isolated in front of this crowd of accusers. As Adam and Eve isolated themselves in a bush and hid from the only one who could actually help them in the garden. That's what sin does. It isolates us. It leads us away from love. So God offers us stories all through Scripture, because the sharing of story diffuses the human capacity for judgment. It enables us to respond rather than to react. Story breeds empathy. Therefore, mercy reminds me of the power of redemption. Healing reminds me that I'm not alone. It softens my heart. It ignites hope. So, what is your story? What is your story? We've heard a couple of stories, Old and New Testament. What is your story? Why are you here right now? You're sitting in this room for a reason, because you have a story. And you apparently believe God is interwoven in that story in some way. And there's always a flip side to every coin, as long as we have eyes and ears to hear and see. At the heart of everyone's story is the narrative of redemption being uttered into the world, whether we realize it or not, whether we purpose it or not, whether it's alive or moribund in us. That means dying. Sometimes I write words in my sermons, I think, why did I use that word? How many of you use the word moribund? That's what I figured. Forget it. Whether it's alive or dying in us, it doesn't matter. We don't always live out of such knowledge. In fact, sometimes we curse at it. We regret the kinship. But ultimately, if we believe God is a redeemer, then all of it, think about this in your story, every piece of it adds up to the whole, which means the poor choices, the mistakes, laziness, sadness, overzealousness, hypocrisy, the lust, all of it is ultimately being reclaimed, redeemed, and blessed. In a kingdom where no lily of the field is overlooked, where no bird of the air ever goes hungry, every moment is a hallowed moment. Every part of your story is sacred to God. The story of the woman caught in adultery reminds us that sin, or turning away from God, acting against our own dignity, self-destruction, that's not an end. It can be the middle of the story, but it's not the end of the story, because God's love and God's mercy are unlimited. The gift of a renewed, ever-deepening life in Christ is available to each one of us. The cultural and religious leaders of Jesus' day, however, were enraged by this woman's actions. I have to wonder why they drug her in there like she was a monster, ready to stone her to death. Where did that hatred come from? They saw, instead of a child of God in front of them, a monster. They reduced her to her sin. And we do that, don't we? The problem is we don't just reduce other people to their sin, we reduce ourselves to our sin, so that we stop seeing the child of God that is there and we see the monster. And so we have no capacity for love or mercy, because who could ever love a beast? That's another Disney movie. Jesus recognized her for who she was. She was a child of God. She was in need of mercy. He forgave her. He restored her relationship. He says, has no one condemned you? Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, don't sin. That's what inspired Ambrose of Milan to write this reflection. One of my favorite quotes from the ancient church. He says, see what a mystery this is. See the goodness of Christ. While the woman is being accused, Christ bends down. When her accusers go out, he looks up. If you want to know the meaning of the words, go and sin no more, let me tell you. Christ has set you free. Let grace now set right in you what punishment has been unable to correct. And I'll read that again because I think it is so, so good. Let grace now set right in you what punishment has been unable to correct. When someone is in sin and they break God's law, there are three paths of response. One, we can condemn, truth with no grace. Two, we can ignore, which is to let people self-destruct and pretend it doesn't matter. Both of these are, of course, unhealthy, but there is a third way, Jesus' way, one that he demonstrated for this woman, the way of healing, the way of restoration. Love can heal while it corrects. It heals because truth is spoken with grace. This woman received mercy. She didn't have to pay a penalty for her crimes. Jesus simply forgave her. And some of you don't believe God can do that. God does that all the time. God can forgive. The one who has been wronged is allowed to forgive. God doesn't have to be paid a price to forgive you. God is allowed to forgive you because he's God. He forgives you all the time. The price he paid was a price of love for you, a price of life for life so that you can live, not so that he can forgive you. God forgives you because God is love, and he can't help but to forgive because he loves you. Because unlike the rest of us, and I know it's hard to believe, Jesus doesn't reduce people to their sin. He doesn't see you as a monster. He hasn't lost his love for you. In fact, his love is stronger than you can imagine. Brad Jersak points out religious legalists would have us infer Jesus says, go and sin no more, or I will condemn you. We always do that. We can't believe Jesus where he stops a sentence. We have to think there's more implied. Go and sin no more, because if you sin again, then I'm going to get you. I don't know why we have to do that. What if Jesus really meant what he said? Just go and sin no more. Well, we have trouble with that because you can't just go and sin no more. What? You can't just quit sinning. Any of you figure that one out yet? Quit sinning? Yeah, unless when we say go and sin no more, we mean something different. Jesus wasn't joking with the woman, and I don't think he was being sarcastic. So what did he mean? What does it mean when the Son of God says to you, neither do I condemn you, now go and sin no more? Well, if sin, hamartia, is to miss the mark, then we have to ask, what is the mark? If the mark is ritual integrity, pure holiness, untainted religiosity, right, then we're all going to miss that. If it's perfect morality, never making a mistake, then we're all going to miss that. But what if missing the mark is a bigger picture? What if Jesus didn't mean every little mistake you make? What if he meant the enslavement to death? What if he meant sin slavery, sin sickness? Don't be a part of that any longer. Well, I think the woman surely could do that. In fact, I wonder if the conversation went something like this. I've just completely wiped clean your record. You can go on and live from this day forward as if you are a new person. You never have to go back to who you used to be. I've given you a new start, a new life. What are you going to do with it? Where will you go? And I think she would have said to Jesus, well, I'll follow you. I'll follow you forever. And Jesus would say, of course you will. Now come and follow me. Come on, get up. Which got me thinking, what if she did? What if she followed Jesus? What if she went and sinned no more? What could that look like? What if to go and sin no more is really just a way of saying to stay in the embrace of God's love, no matter what? Unlike Adam and Eve, who hide in the garden in shame. Unlike the prodigal brothers who slave for their father, not understanding his love for them. That is inherent. What if to go and sin no more is to accept God's love? To believe it. To trust it. I could imagine Jesus' words, go and sin no more, being less of a legal demand. Go and don't do any more bad stuff. And instead, a creative command. Go and sin no more. Like, let there be light. And there was light. I imagine when Jesus spoke those words, the light in the Father's house came on. Heaven's light, God's love. If somehow this woman found herself tripping again on her own humanity, she would forever orient herself towards God's welcome rather than running away into the night. Her time of darkness was over. The accusers had been sent away. It's no accident that Hasatan, the one you call Satan or the devil, is actually in Hebrew the accuser, because that's what he does. He accuses. And Jesus speaks over him, where are your accusers? Have they gone away? And we say, yes, Lord, they have. And Jesus says, neither do I condemn you. Now go and sin no more. Jesus, whenever he's around, reminds us that mercy does triumph over judgment. To put this in other words, I think this lady, this unnamed woman, she could screw up. I don't think when he said go and sin no more, it was a legal demand, like you better not make any more mistakes. I think that's what we infer because we are still screwed up ourselves. What I think Jesus meant was now you can be new. You can be different. Now you know my love. Live in that love. Embrace it and believe it. An invitation that I think has been extended to all of us. But it's easy to think that he just meant don't make any more mistakes. But I don't think that's what he meant. From that day on, I think it is entirely possible that even if she made mistakes, she would never again really fail to be in the love of God. She could commit particular sins, but she would never, ever again be alienated from the God of love. She would never again be lost in darkness, slave to sin and death, because she would never be reduced to sin another moment in her life. She was now standing in heaven's light. She was changed. No longer was this woman a monster, this nameless one. She now understood she was a child of God, delivered by the grace of Jesus, perfectly, infinitely loved by the creator of all things. And I believe John, the gospel writer, leaves her nameless on purpose, as he leaves himself nameless as the beloved disciple. Because in John's gospel, we're supposed to find our gospel, our good news, our story with Jesus. Because in this woman's story, you're meant to insert your name. The restored sinner is you. And Jesus has declared over you, neither do I condemn you. Now go and sin no more.